We will investigate the arrival of Catholicism in Australia in this video. When did Catholicism first arrive in Australia? There may have been landings of Catholics on Australian land in the 1600s, however it wasn't until the arrival of the first fleet in 1788 that the first significant introduction of Catholicism to Australia was made. The first Mass on Australian soil may have been said that year by Father Louis Receveur, a French priest who arrived in Australia with an expedition of French Navy ships 6 days after the first fleet, but there is no evidence to support this, and perhaps it was unlikely, given that Father Louis had been injured in an earlier clash with an indigenous population in the Samoan Islands, and died shortly after his arrival in Australia. Around 10% of the convicts which arrived with the first fleet were Catholics, many from Ireland, Scotland, and England. By 1803, 2,086 Irish convicts had arrived at Botany Bay. Not many priests were available to the new arrivals. By 1828, the population of Catholics in Australia was around 10,000, but only 374 of these were born and raised in lay Catholic families in Australia. There remained a shortage of priests. Many of the growing number of Catholics in Australia went for very long stretches without ever seeing a priest. In 1800 there had been an arrival of priests, but they were convicts. Father James Dixon, one of the convicts, was allowed to say Mass from 1803 to 1804, but the governor withdrew this permission, being worried about Dixon's privileges. Father Dixon returned to Ireland soon after, and again the colony was left without a priest until 1820, when the government sent out 2 chaplains, Irish priests who had volunteered, Father John Joseph Terry and Father Philip Connolly. This is the formal occasion of the arrival of the Catholic Church in Australia. More priests arrived in the years that followed, many continuing to come from Ireland and England. In 1835, Father John Bede Paulding was appointed as the first Catholic bishop in Australia. However, it wasn't until 1842 that a hierarchy was approved by Rome, which then made Father Paulding Archbishop. In 1844, Archbishop Paulding consecrated Francis Murphy as Bishop of Adelaide, the first episcopal consecration in Australia. The 1840s were an unsettled time for the Catholic Church in Australia. There was conflict between its members, between the Archbishop and the people, and other branches of Christianity prevented the Catholic Church from dominating. Religion and politics were often associated, and the representative government in Australia began in 1842. In 1848, the provinces and dioceses of the Catholic Church in Australia were set, though they were changed as population grew. A report to Rome in 1851 indicated that there were 35 priests who ministered to approximately 55,000 people. Half of these people were born in Ireland, and many others were descended from Irish Catholics. Irish priests in Australia continued to outnumber Australian-born priests until the 1930s. Sending convicts to Australia stopped in 1852. However, the population grew in the 1850s with the beginning of the gold rush. By the end of the 1850s, there was an Archbishop of Sydney, Archbishop of Hobart, and bishops of Adelaide, Melbourne, Perth, and Brisbane. Many new settlers arrived in the second half of the century, including from religious orders. The First World War changed the dynamics of life in Australia. Australians fought with the British in Turkey, Egypt, and the Middle East, as well as in Europe. Following the war, Australia and Britain subsidized the cost of people emigrating between the two countries, and many British people settled in Australia. The White Australia policy was in force, however, which restricted immigration from other countries. Racism continued until the 1930s when the Second World War began. After World War II, however, Australia accepted 170,000 immigrants who were displaced or chose to leave their country to begin a new life in Australia.